Hello. My daughter's in preschool, but I will not use preschool quieting tactics. Hi, my name's Rebecca Lehrer, and I am the co-founder of the Mashup Americans and the co-head of podcasts at Hello Sunshine. My other co in those things is right there, so she'll tell you a little about herself. Just wanted to introduce you to our panel today. Blair is not here because, schedules, but we are here. And we're just talking about that. We're not talking about diversity, but we're talking about telling our stories, us at the center, not relative to anybody else, but relative to ourselves. So that is it, and we do that in a bunch of different ways in all of the stuff that we're producing. So I'm going to start with my mashup. My name's Rebecca Lehrer. I'm a Salvadoran Jewish American. I'm a mom. I am an entrepreneur. I guess I'm a podcast producer, and I want to start making podcasts in Spanglish. This is TK Dutes.
Hi. And my mashup is I am a woman, Haitian, born in America, avid non-code switcher as much as possible. And I love making podcasts for anybody, but especially for people of color.
I like that, avid non-code.
Yeah. Oh, I try to get away with it.
More like you. Hi, I am Amy Choi. I am Rebecca's the other half of her brain. I am a first-generation Korean American married to a Colombian Mexican American. I got 2 mashy babies, and I am a podcast producer. That feels weird to say still. Journalist, editor, and I like making and sharing stories.
Okay, so we love seeing your faces, and so many people that we love are here. And I think we wanted to talk first about the idea of taking ownership of our stories. How do we share our stories without exploiting ourselves? And I think one of the things I wanted to throw to Amy on is the idea of how we think about addressing hard issues in this for us, by us. We'll call it FUBU for the rest of for all of you guys, but in this sort of idea of what we are producing and the way that we're thinking about content that is recentered on our experiences. How do you sort of think about, how do we deal with hard things without exposing ourselves too much?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of pressure on particularly women of color, anybody from a marginalized community, to somehow exploit all the hard things in your life because it makes for a good story for a mainstream audience. And we are just not here for that. I think the importance that we place on being honest and truthful about what is challenging in working in mainstream media, in trying to get our stories heard, is that often we just want to share our stories. And I think it's not to pick ourselves apart for an audience or to somehow justify our existence or justify our story or defend who we are. We are simply stating and putting a stake in the ground. We're here, and these are stories worth listening to.
Yeah. I mean, is there something that you found, TK, in terms of responses to your work? Actually, let's step back a second. Can you tell us a little bit about the breadth of things that you do? Because you're telling a lot of amazing stories with you and us at the center, and I'd love for you to share it.
Yeah, so currently, I started at WBAI, so that's people-powered social justice radio. So that kind of never left me. And then from there, have been doing my own morning show, which is 3 times a week. And it's very specific in that, sure, we're talking about current events, but more than talking about current events, we're having social commentary. And when I say non-code switching, a lot of time, I just don't on there.
Right.
Because when you make a thing that is yours, I talk on there. I talk to my friends, and all the listeners are my friends. And I don't do extra work. I don't explain people through it. It's you. Can you hear me?
Right.
And so I said what I said, so that's what I do on that. And the morning show is called TK in the AM. And then I produce other podcasts for folks. So I've worked on Third Rail, which is a Brooklyn Movement Center podcast about gentrification and living in Brooklyn, in central Brooklyn, as a person of color. So that's very specific in telling the story of being a black person affected by gentrification in central Brooklyn. So that's like recentering several stories in one. And then I recently worked on the Curvy Cons podcast, which is hosted by 2 women of color, and it's about being curvy. It's about being plus size, and
As we, by the way, both sat down and we're like, our pants are too tight for
we
these
had a
chairs.
Curvy Con moment. But they're having a FUBU conversation.
Yeah.
And my role as a person that is not plus size is to let them express themselves and talk to the curvy crowd. I'm not making them talk to skinny people and understand what being a big girl is like. I'm not making them talk to white people to make them understand what being a fat black girl is like. I'm not doing any of that. My job as a producer is to make sure they tell the story of being curvy girls in black skin and what does that sound like in their voices.
I'd love to just take a pause, or just for one thing is, wow, this got like so much less bright, which is nice for my very terrible eyes, is this idea of the explanatory comma. And I think that's something we think a lot about at the Mashup Americans, and in a lot of the work we're doing at Hello Sunshine is like, again, who's your audience, and like, what do you have to explain to them so that they get it, and what can you just assume that they'll figure out?
Yeah.
Or that they already know because it's made for them. So we have a policy on the Mashup Americans that we don't explain like food things to people. I'm never going to tell you what kimchi is, because if you don't know what kimchi is, that's really your problem. And also, you can Google it. And so we feel very, very strongly about that. And there was a great conversation on Code Switch several years ago about this, but they produce on NPR, right? And a lot of that goes on a morning edition, or All Things Considered. That's a different audience that might need an explanation. We're not producing for that audience. We're producing for ourselves. You're welcome in, listen in, but we're not producing this for you. We're not going to explain it. Now, when we produce with our show How It Is, which is a storytelling show, one of the things on that is that we allow everybody to identify themselves. So that's a really, really important thing. So if as an example is, we had this extraordinary writer, Kayla Whaley, tell a story about her Me Too experiences as a disabled woman and feeling alienated from the entire movement, frankly. And she tells a story, but we don't have our host identify any of her hyphens, or her disability, her as a writer. We just say, this is Kayla Whaley, and then Kayla tells her own story and how she defines herself. Now, I can't speak to the disabled community, but I know that there's a conversation about, am I a disabled person, or am I a person with disability? That's for Kayla to say, not for me to impose on her how she defines herself. And that's a really, really important part of how we see centering our stories on ourselves and on the people that we're kind of giving platform to, which is part of what we see our opportunity to do, which I think you're saying about like the curvy girls. Like you may not exactly be that, but you can elevate their stories and help them get it out to the world exactly as they want to tell it.
Yeah. And like to that, the explainer thing, or to even like the identifying thing is like, so at Thirst Aid Kit, where I'm currently at now, which is a BuzzFeed podcast, I could put some shady thing in there about BuzzFeed, but whatever.
That's an explanatory comma.
I did.
BuzzFeed, a company, comma.
Yep. Well, a lot of times fans that are listeners of the show of Thirst Aid Kit will be like, well, why don't you have more queer people on, right? And we do. And the thing is, their name is Jamie or John, and we go, welcome, our friend Jamie or John, the writer at, and if they don't identify themselves, we don't have to, it's up to them too.
Right.
Like, how do you feel when someone goes, oh, hey, Sally, writer at Vulture, also gay person? Like, the fuck? Like, Jesus Christ. So like, don't go TK or resident black. Like, no, that's how y'all sound. So yeah, don't do that.
I think the other thing, thank you, TK, my black Haitian friend.
Right, see? I love it though.
Well, that's because I think the other point of this too is that when we talk about making stories for ourselves and we celebrate those identities, as it is awesome that you are Black and Haitian and that you are here and you're telling your story. Not like, this is TK and also she's this thing. And we're going to keep that somehow.
It's fundamental to who you are and how you see the world and how you tell stories.
And I think we always are asking ourselves the question, how do we get more people invited to the party? Who is in the room? And when we say we, who is we?
Yeah.
When we say they, who is they? Because if somehow we can't, if we're not honest about that, and like really do some interrogating in our own creative minds and our own producing minds about who we want, suddenly, somehow, everything that Rebecca and I do ends up Latina and Korean.
Right.
There's sometimes I'm like, we're the only place that has too many Koreans on their podcast.
Right.
It's
but
like,
it's
we're
easy,
like, we don't,
even for us, when this is like what we do all day long, to fall into, I don't know, a tunnel, a cave, something, where we're only seeing things through our lens.
Yeah.
So it has to be very intentional. So we ask ourselves, again, all the time, who is the we, who is the them? Who is inside the room and who is not?
Yeah.
We had Soledad O'Brien on our podcast last year, and if you should just please follow her on social media, because she is so into throwing shade these days, and it's like, I'm really living for her, Instagramming her own tweets, but that's another thing. We can talk as like a protocol, whether that's okay, but I don't Twitter, so it's good for me. So one of the things she talked about, a lot of things, is this idea of when she was making Latin, and I think I talked about this a little last year as well, but when she was making Latinos in America, I believe that's what it's called, but people in the room kept being like, well, they like, and they like, and they, and she was like, they is me. Like, no, and we don't. Look around and understand it. And the other piece that she talked about, which completely changed everything for me, and it's part of this identifier piece, is how you set people up really, really matters. Like deficit framing is what she talked about. This idea of the way you talk about, well, she struggled through these things and then made it here, that you would talk about very differently, if you're honest, when you're talking about a young Black woman than if you were talking about a young white man, even if the storyline without that would be very similar. And I think it's a really critical opportunity we have as people with platforms, as people who are storytellers, as people who get to elevate other people's stories, to remember that, wait, why are we including that information? Yeah. What are we trying to get from it? What are we trying to elicit from our audience without kind of pandering or minimizing it?
And I mean, low key, we as marginalized people, people of different cultures, ethnicities, genders, and gender identities, we tend to sometimes, low key, we buy into that too, right? Like, we deficit frame ourselves. We learn early that we can get rewards from the dominant culture. Like, if you look at writing your college essay, right? Mm-hmm. If I write about my downtrodden, and I became a basketball star, and look at me now, that
Were
that's
you a basketball star?
No, and child, we're not gonna talk about that time in my life. But we learn early that if I tell this story about how downtrodden I am, and that the dominant culture, and let's go ahead and we just have to name it because we're out here, the dominant culture. Generally, we're talking about white culture, right? Mm-hmm. And we're talking about, so when you're in the room, ask yourself if you're able-bodied in a room full of disabled people and you're talking a certain way, am I part of the dominant culture, right? Yes, as an able-bodied person. Right. If, so just think about these things. So we tend to put ourselves in deficit framing as well, and we don't recognize when we're doing it, and we don't recognize when we're perpetuating that story inside of our own stories. Right.
Well, that's the idea of the kind of the Bechdel test too, right? Like, we're talking to each other not relative to about men, we're talking to each other about something else. And I think that's what we know we're doing in our real lives. But wait, just as a side note, I just want to talk about what Thirst Aid Kit does. Speaking of talking about men, is
Guys, this is my favorite podcast.
yeah,
I love
it's our
it so
favorite.
much.
If you haven't heard the one about To All the Boys I Loved Before, just imagine me walking down the street, fully blushing and screaming when they kept like putting Peter Kavinsky's voice on. So I think one of the things that you do beautifully on that show is recenter women's sexuality. And it's not relative to anything else. It's not relative to men's sexuality or being attractive to somebody else. I'd love to hear a little bit about the kind of origin of that and how you see it as you're kind of making it.
So I'd like to just start off by just saying it's definitely a group effort.
Yeah.
And something that started way before I got there.
Yeah.
Shout out to Julia and the team. Like we all, and then that's also testament to coming into a workplace where certain conversations didn't have to be had. Right? Mm-hmm. We didn't have to have the conversation of, oh man, it's too many white guys. We're talking about too many white guys. Sometimes it's just like, yo, let's look at the roster. We're not paying attention to a certain group. We need to pay attention. Like certain conversations, like it's in workplaces, you have to force them. Like, well, you know, we might have had too many white guys on here. Nope. At BuzzFeed or when we were the Pod Squad in full, we just were like, oh, yo, this is real. It's time to talk about other people now, you know? So at Thirst Aid Kit, recentering the story of women's lust and it's a very openly, like the two hosts, shout out to Bim and Nicole, they are two cisgender heterosexual women. And they let you know that up front, and they let you know that they can't speak for any other category, but they will invite other people to come speak on it themselves. And that's how we recenter those populations so that they too can have a good time listening to the show. And also, being that we don't, you know, like we're not gonna say, oh, gay writer, blah, blah, blah. That person gets to come on and thirst for whoever. Mm-hmm. And we've had situations where, you know, the person is queer, and guess what? They thirsted for someone opposite gender. And so you wouldn't even know it. Right. That's the thing. So letting people have their thirst and lust, and also letting them express that and not interfering with it is part of also like recentering the story.
It also feels particularly subversive, I think, to let women, not let, because we're recentering this, but to just be sexual and own that, which is the reality of at least how my friends talk about these things, which is like, and to hear them be like, oh gosh, we did Google how old he is to make sure it was appropriate. Like, it was, I felt so, it was a perfect example of how the intimacy of audio and the reflection of your own experience, but by two people who have thought through it and have also, are incredibly, just like they can put it into a context, is like how powerful that can be. Yeah. And not like too intellectualized, but they're also so smart. Yeah. So then it's just a wonderful combo.
There's a lot of levels of like vetting and like, is this appropriate, and who are we talking about and who are we talking to before a person gets to even be like considered what we call a thirst object on the show. Like sometimes I'll suggest someone and they'll be like, Google them, problematic, you know? But and that's it.
You guys, another one to recommend is the Hollywood Chris's. That's a really great thing to dive into there. I think one of the things I still wanted to get to in this sort of section of the conversation is like responses from other people about our work. And I think, Amy, you know, some of the kind of ways that we've had to push back on, you know what I'm going to say.
Well, sometimes white people don't get it.
Yeah.
And that includes our white distributors and our white networks and our white bosses, and sometimes they don't. And my internal response is always, I don't fucking care. But the better response is, I think, to understand that for us, while we are not in the business of explaining ourselves, and we are not in the business of defending our stories or defending the import of our stories ever, we are also not in the business of shaming people for not getting it. So I think what we always try to do is to make sure that as creators, across the board, what we're making is excellent. And so we can always stand on that and on the quality of the work that we're doing, knowing that sometimes it has to be twice as good. That said, I think a lot of the response we get is to add more explanatory commas, which is a lot of like, well, when you say, you know, I can't even think of it.
Or it'll be like, why don't you have that other point of view? And we're like, what?
There's a lot of radio out there with
Yeah,
other points of
also
view.
like there's no white people in Crazy Rich Asians, and that's a really good ass movie.
Right.
But
I think that is one core response that I think when we are producing original work for the Mashup Americans, that we sometimes butt up against, and now that we are independent, have a lot more freedom, and we have found that our audience really resonates with that. And then I think when we are putting our producing hats on for Hello Sunshine and for our other partners, often there's a thought that it's easy. Right, that getting a really diverse roster of talent is easy, or that getting somebody that checks all these boxes for them is easy. And we're saying it's not. And when you hand us a list saying you want us to make a mashy show for you, and all of your suggested ideas are all white straight men, you also have to do some work. And or we're going to push you to do the work, because that's why it's somewhere in your heart you know you want something different. Yeah. You just don't know how to get there. Right. And so we try not to scream in our heads too much. Sometimes it happens, but I think those are often the two larger, I think, challenges that we get to our work.
And I think one of the exciting things about the work, say at Hello Sunshine, which is women-centered, is that we get to apply our mashup lens there. So it's like a very intentional casting and a broad definition of womanhood too, and that is a very, very, it's very important to us and to the company that we're doing that work. I think I want to hear, TK, a little bit about kind of the audience and the audience love, and how the kind of feedback you get, particularly on Thursday Aid Kit, but I'm sure on the other shows as well, which are so specific.
Yeah, and I mean, and to your point, Amy, about like having to make other people understand this thing, right? So like we at Thursday Kit bring receipts everywhere we go. Screenshots, emails, voicemails. So our listenership is very active in that. And child, they send us stuff. One lady said she fell off her treadmill listening to it. Then you get folks that are they have an emotional response. And you just thought you were making a fun show about lusting out loud in pop culture. Mm-hmm. No, to some, you don't know who's listening. And when they write that, that's receipts for me. So I might not be able to make you understand it from your dominant culture point of view, but I can bring you 10 emails right now or 150 tweets if you just use the hashtag that show people being affected. Like one
people write fan fiction.
They write fan fiction. Like they use their creative muscles because they listen to a thing. First of all, prompting people to do that is a big deal, right? And like we don't ask. They just send us stuff. Right. I'm like, damn. And then like we just had a couple that they listen as a couple, and they asked if we would, if the host would propose give them a mutual proposal on the show. Mm-hmm. So we did that for the first anniversary episode. And so like that's the stuff that, okay, I might not be able to make you understand what female-driven or female-driven thirst looks like in pop culture, but I can make you understand that a ton of other people get it. Mm-hmm. And these are your customers, and these are the people you want to click on things. Right. So don't worry if you don't get it. I'm bringing you a show that brings mad numbers and that brings you clicks. So chill. Yeah.
Chill.
And I also think that one of the other pieces that rings true to me about that is that when people are authentic to their selves and their stories, it resonates with a lot of people. And I don't know about like dominant, like in that case, like if, and I just don't care if white men listen to Thursday Aid Kit, frankly. They should, because they get a lot. They learn a lot of tips and tools. Yeah. But what I think it does happen that the shared pieces of our hyphens come through, right? And that's where the Mashup Americans started, right? Is that Amy and my hyphens are different hyphens, but we were both first-gen American. We were marrying people from different backgrounds. We were trying to figure out what that means, what's important to us, and we have totally different relationships to our families, but we're navigating things similarly, which I'm sure you are, TK, too, as a first-gen. And that shared thing allows us to kind of hone in on each other's specifics in a really amazing way, and I think gives longevity and to this kind of storytelling.
Yeah.
And it makes me relate to because it's just done so well. I'm a lusty woman.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I think also, when we first started Mashup, we were looking out into the world for something that reflected us, and it didn't exist. And so we took advice from the great Mindy Kaling and said, why not us? Why don't we do it? And I think one of the main problems, and we had both had long careers in media, which was that here was the story, right? Here's this big old vertical that takes up 89% of the air and the space, and that was the story. And then here's a vertical that's the Black story. Here's a vertical that's the Spanish-speaking story, and then maybe there was a queer, maybe an Asian,
there isn't
back there.
No.
There was not really any vertical. We were what? We have been trained also to believe that the white dude story was the story.
Yeah.
When actually, if we cut across again and looked at what we were actually talking about, we could get into our details and tell more universal, tell more universal truths if we could actually get rid of the stupid verticals.
And as listeners, real quick, I think listeners have to understand that they can ingest these stories, right? If I listen to your show and I'm following the thread of culture, or if I'm listening to a show that's hosted by Jewish hosts talking about their grandma giving them chicken soup, I understand that as a grandma giving chicken soup, not as a Jewish story. And I think when listeners are coming to something, they see X faces and they go, I can't relate to that. And I'm bro, yes you can. I literally I was born, I lived a life, and I'm gonna die. And if we all go from there, that's a general truth that in this room we all share.
Yep.
Right? We're all born, hey, high five. We all have that in common. We're all living some hard shit. Got that in common. And we're all gonna die. So yo, we friends. You can listen to my show.
I think that what also resonates to me about what you're saying there is this I think a lot of us in storytelling space came from either journalism organizations or journalistic backgrounds. And I think that sometimes there's a sense of faux neutrality that we feel we have to have, and we don't have to have that, because our whole selves and our experiences inform the way we see the world and make for more valuable stories, and are incredibly, they will and are making the world better. And as we said earlier, we're not counterculture, we are the culture, so we're here. We're telling our stories, and we're really excited for everybody else to catch up. But I think that's how I'd like to end. I think anything else you want to share about before we wrap up? I'm impressed. Look at that.
Yeah, look at us on time.
Countdown. Yeah.
Right.
That you guys want to share.
I literally thought that was the actual time and the time. Not.
We're very tired, but I think I think that's where we wanted to sort of end up, which is that there can be joy in telling our stories and standing in the truth for things that matter, and defining our own path is not about diversity; it's about truth.
And I would say if you're sharing, if you're a listener of one type of podcast or a type of book or whatever it is your media, right, and it comes from a different culture than yours, or you want to suggest it to a friend that's not of your culture, suggest it. As one of my co-hosts of Thursday Kid says, say it with your whole chest. Yeah. Suggest it openly, freely. Don't worry about if they'll be comfortable with it. If there's good content in there and value, that's all that counts. Say it with your whole chest. Don't be well, they're a librarian and I don't know if they'll be into this raucous thing, but I find it fun. Don't explain that shit. Yeah. Just share it. That's it. Share what you like what you share.
Yes. Amen.
Amen. I would just say, welcome. Come, join us. It's fun.
Yeah. Okay, thank you.
Thank you.